Russia wants the UN Security Council to endorse the Syrian ceasefire agreement that it brokered together with the United States. Our world leaders attended a special session of the UN on Syria. The U.S. Secretary of State lashed out at Russia for making incorrect statements about the facts of this war. Meanwhile, Russia reminded the UN member countries about the way some of these so-called rebels and terrorists broke the truce. In this edition of the debate, we'll look at what the chances are for peace talks to happen as requested.
The UN Security Council has held crisis talks on Syria with hopes to revive a ceasefire that broke down days ago. The truce brokered by the U.S. and Russia was called off by the Syrian government after U.S.-led coalition airstrikes killed over 80 Syrian forces. Tensions further flared on Monday after an attack on an aid convoy that left 12 people, including medics, dead in Aleppo. Divisions between Moscow and Washington remained high during the Security Council session over the deadly attacks. The Russian foreign minister said his country had presented all evidence on the aid convoy attack in Aleppo, which the U.S. has blamed on Moscow. He also called for a thorough and impartial investigation into the deadly incident, while once again denying any Russian involvement and implicating U.S. drones in the deadly attack. Sergei Lavrov warned Security Council members that nothing would happen in Syria and there would be no unilateral pauses unless all parties involved have a comprehensive approach with simultaneous steps.
I believe that the time has come to think about revisiting this list of terrorist organizations. The key priority is to separate the opposition forces from the terrorists of ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra.
This while, the U.S. Secretary of State blamed the Syrian president for violations of the ceasefire, adding that Bashar Assad does not believe in a truce. John Kerry urged banning all Syrian government forces from flying over territories held by the opposition.
I believe that to restore credibility to the process, we must move forward to try to immediately ground all aircraft flying in those key areas in order to de-escalate the situation.
Both Lavrov and Kerry, however, spoke about resuming talks, with Lavrov criticizing some participants for trying to put forward certain preconditions or ultimatums to sabotage the UN resolution.
The Russians will not agree to it. I don't think the Chinese will agree to it. If he's looking for a new Security Council resolution that would force the grounding of the Russian and Syrian air forces, he's not going to get that.
Lavrov went on to say that during the latest truce, Assad's forces had started to withdraw from their positions as part of the agreement, but the same was not applied by opposition forces. Although a truce might be the only chance to end the 5-year conflict in Syria, ceasefires put in place so far have failed to hold, as foreign-backed militant groups have not abided by their commitments or used the event to regroup and rearm.
So the so-called peaceful Wahhabis, the peaceful terrorists, the moderate head choppers, are people that are absolutely necessary leverage to get to what is still the end game for the Obama administration, and that is regime change. Assad must go.
Furthermore, the exclusion of militant groups has become a main obstacle in achieving any form of long-lasting peace, and a failure for the international community.
Our guest joining us for this edition of the debate, we have journalist and political commentator Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, who joins us from London. And we have Middle East expert Jihad Mouracadeh, who joins us from Beirut. I'd like to welcome you both. And Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, I don't know if you caught the session at the UN that happened on this special session on Syria. How do you look first, if you've seen it, the approach that Kerry had in terms of the tone and his game plan, the way he addressed the different details, specifically pointing at some points, and as I'm looking now, that they say it was directed at Russia taking the blame?
I think it actually represents very well the current situation in Syria, whereby it has become a sort of a standoff between the USA and Russia, with the Syrians, who are the main party involved, almost in the back of proceedings. So we already remember that barely a week ago we had Kerry and Lavrov actually standing at a press conference announcing the successful agreement over a ceasefire, which the Americans very, very promptly violated when they killed the 82 Syrian soldiers. And now again we're seeing that this is a standoff between almighty Russia and almighty America, and the chessboard is Syria. The tone, of course, every comment was addressed to Russia. Everything is aimed and geared towards what Russia and how Russia will react. And of course, it doesn't really impact either party, in fact, because the victims are essentially Syrians. So therefore, this is a geopolitical game between these two very powerful nations on the back, on the blood, and on the destruction and rubble of Syria.
Well, how do you look at Jihad Mouracadeh, the way that Kerry made his points directed at Russia again? I mean, he said that it was Russia that was responsible, either Russia or Syrian forces that were responsible for those convoys that were, according to them, destroyed via air. Now, at the same time, we know what happened prior to that, and that was at least a minimum of 80 Syrian soldiers to be killed by the U.S. Now, is the U.S. and through Kerry trying to say that Russia is at fault and they're not by making these types of accusations?
These are not accusations, these are facts. Considering that the only planes flying in the area were essentially either Russian or Syrian, and considering that the convoys were bombed by helicopters and barrel bombs and the Sukhoi 24, which has been on the radar screen of the Americans, it is difficult to say otherwise. I consider that this is the absolute truth. I do not consider that the Russians have any ground to stand on, because it's only today that they came up with that drone story. Why they didn't come up with it for the last 2 days. They started by saying no Russian, no Syrian planes, and they said it was the convoy that blew up. Then they said, there was a drone. So the Russians are very much deep into it. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, with regards to the bombing of the Syrian air base in Deir ez-Zor, at least the Americans were prompt to come up with excuses and apologies to say, we have done this by mistake. The Russians never came up with any excuses and never came up, they came up with excuses, but never came up with any apologies. No, in my opinion, the Americans are perfectly correct on this one, and the Russians are not. On the other hand, it was only Saturday, and the deal was signed on Monday. It was only Saturday, and not immediately afterwards, as the lady said, that the Americans bombed Deir ez-Zor by mistake. And during all this time, there were humanitarian convoys waiting to get the proper permissions from the Syrian government, and never got it.
Well, you know, the thing that comes up here, Hafsa, Kara-Mustapha, is first of all, what would Russia have to gain, or Syrian army, from targeting these convoys? Then again, some of the sources that Jihad, or a source perhaps, I'm not too sure, that Jihad Mouracadeh uses, alleging that these were targeted via air from Russian Air Force, it's not what John Kerry said. But at the end, I'm trying to understand how these two incidents play out. Does the calculated, by many accounts, attack on the Syrian army soldiers go with what the U.S. wants on the ground? How does Russia make gains out of targeting the convoys? I'm trying to weigh the two together here.
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate PressTV. The very major officials of both US and Russian governments have still not actually agreed to what genuinely happens, and there is an investigation carried out with suppositions as to what may have happened, but no one has actually come out and stated that the attack was factually the responsibility of Russians. So the fact that my co-panelist is actually stating that it's a fact that Russia is responsible is actually quite impressive, because I suspect he's the only person who must have the sources that even the American administration doesn't yet have. As you rightly point out, I really don't see any benefit for the Russians to actually attack an aid convoy, and I think that it was the very mature position to adopt was to actually investigate what were the possibilities, which is why it's taken them 2 days to come up with the drone theory, which obviously indicates that it's an action carried out by the Americans. We know that it can't be the Syrians, essentially, because they don't have the military capabilities of carrying out night flights. So So obviously it has to be someone with sophisticated weaponry. And again, there is no interest for the Russians to carry out this attack, especially since it doesn't particularly harm American interests or could be seen as some sort of retaliation for the crime that was committed by the Americans. Again, I don't really see how we can somehow congratulate the Americans for waiting 5 days for violating the terms of the ceasefire, as if somehow we need to be grateful that it took them from Monday to Saturday to actually violate the ceasefire, as if somehow that makes the crime of blitzing 82 soldiers, Syrian soldiers, somehow acceptable. I do wonder how the American public opinion would have woken up Sunday morning to the news that 82 of their soldiers had been blitzed out of the sky for no reason, and at a time of ceasefire. They may very well have apologized, but we need to remember that why were their planes even flying at a time of a ceasefire? That's the main question. There was no reason for American planes to fly during a time of ceasefire. Therefore, it very clearly indicates that there was a deliberate attempt to scupper the ceasefire and actually ensure that ISIS would make gains whereby they'd been pushed in the past. Now, where does this lead really essentially is that this is going to pursue the conflict for many, many months, indeed many more years to come, because the policy of America at the moment is to engage in conflicts in the region and allow them to fester and go on for many, many years. We've seen a scenario in Afghanistan, we've seen it in Iraq, and now that America is firmly installed on Syrian soil, I think we can expect to see them for many, many years. And the best way to ensure that they remain for many years is to constantly shuffle the ground and ensure that there's no end to this conflict.
Well, let's see here. This is what Jihad Mouracadeh, the U.S. Secretary of State, has said, that he posed the question, how do we get things back on track in terms of the ceasefire? Immediately ground all aircraft flying in those key areas where the Syrian government forces are and where the Russian air forces are. Doesn't, in essence, the U.S., in a sense, is pushing for a no-fly zone when it says that?
So is that for me?
First of all, let me correct
No,
a
for
few
Jihad
facts.
Mouracadeh. I'll come to you in a sec. Go ahead. Jihad Mouracadeh.
Let me correct a few facts. First of all, the Americans were perfectly allowed to attack Daesh areas under the ceasefire agreement. Daesh areas were outside this particular agreement. So what they were attacking was Daesh. And so the premise of the lady in London is incorrect, in my opinion. Second, just to get the record straight, while Kerry did not say it, John Kerry, Secretary Kerry did not say it in the United Nations Security Council today, the White House made a statement about it, and the American Defense Department also made a statement about the Russian and or Syrian involvement. So it is not a figment of my imagination. Now, with regards to your question, I'm sorry, what was it again?
Well, it is about what John Kerry has said. He said that in the areas where these convoys or aid is going to go through, we want
the no-fly zone.
Yeah. Well, if that's what he wants, because he's saying no Russian Air Force or no Syrian Army, Syrian Air Force.
Yes. He was very specific about areas in north of Syria where there are rebel forces, some of which are considered as being opposition forces supported by the U.S., some of which are al-Nusra or whatever. What he said, let's quit, let's ground all air forces in these areas in order precisely to avoid such incidents in the future and probably to restart humanitarian aid, which the UN tonight said it was ready to reconsider humanitarian aid, provided there are no aircrafts flying in the area.
The area that he's talking about is mostly these so-called rebel forces, which we're not too sure if they're combined or not with some of these terrorists, mostly occupied by them, or the Syrian army is present.
Absolutely, because as far as the Americans are concerned, what the Russians call terrorists, they call opposition forces. So as long as there is no agreement, they are saying, let's freeze the area, let's get humanitarian support in, okay, irrespective of who's who, and then we can rethink again about a political process.
Well, I'm not a military analyst, Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, but if this were to happen, an area where there's mostly of these so-called rebels combined with some of the terrorists, maybe not, and if this was to be enforced, wouldn't that create the perfect opportunity for the forces on the ground of these so-called rebels to overtake that area and therefore, by some accounts, reach that ultimate goal that the U.S. has wanted along with some of its allies, and that's to partition that area off?
I'm sorry, the opportunity goes both ways.
It's for Hafsa Kara-Mustapha.
I'm sorry, just a sec.
Go ahead.
Just a second, please. The opportunity goes both ways. If Mr. Lavrov today spoke about 300 incidents of breaking the ceasefire, there were 300 incidents of the Syrian government breaking ceasefire also during the same period. It's not because John Kerry did not mention it that it does not exist. It is well documented in and all over the press and so on. So therefore, the Syrian government is breaking the ceasefire as well as the rebels.
Well,
no, the Syrian government is the leader. No.
Go ahead, Hafsa Kara-Mustapha.
No, the Syrian government actually leads the Syrian nation, and therefore the Syrian government is perfectly entitled to travel and be wherever.
The Syrian government is irrelevant.
Across the entire
The Syrian government is irrelevant.
I'm sorry, but that is your opinion. There is a whole majority of Syrians. There is a majority of Syrians who support their.
No, the whole majority of the Syrians.
Or not care is irrelevant.
Not at all.
Your opinion is irrelevant. It's the Syrian opinion that really is most important, I think.
How about the Syrians who are fighting?
Don't interrupt. Don't shout. Don't interrupt. I didn't interrupt. I let you speak. Now let me speak, please. Okay?
No,
that's
I
enough.
will interrupt.
No,
I'm
that's
sorry.
enough.
You
No,
are
Let Hafsa Kara-Mustapha
you're
talk.
not Syrian, and I don't care what you think.
Okay, fine. Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, go ahead.
Irrelevant
John
because this is
Mouracadeh,
about
please.
Syrians. You can speak all you like. This is about Syrians and what the Syrians feel. The Syrian government, which is the legitimate government of Syria, is perfectly entitled to be wherever the Syrian nation is. And they are perfectly entitled to travel across their nation. Now, can you stop shouting in my ear so that I can finish my point? Because I did not shout in your ear when you were rambling on. Please.
Finish your point. Finish your point.
Yeah, no, I want it. Well, if you stop talking, I could finish my point. Thank you.
Go ahead.
My point about the Syrian government being perfectly entitled to be wherever it sees fit, because it is the legitimate representative of Syria. And there is an overwhelming majority of Syrians who continuously support not only their leadership, but their national army. Now, in reference to whether in the opposition you have rebels or whether you have Daesh is almost irrelevant, because whoever has taken up arms and funds from foreign entities to fight and overthrow the legitimate government of their country is by definition a terrorist. If you take any country whereby you have rebel groups that have taken up arms and have received arms funding and support from a foreign entity in a bid to overthrow the legitimate government of their nation, they are by definition a terrorist organization. So irrespective of the nature of the groups that are in opposition, whereby we're talking of the head choppers of ISIS, or whereby we're talking even of the supposedly more moderate aspects of these opposition members, the minute they have accepted funds and support from foreign nations, they are traitors to their nation, and therefore they are terrorist groups, and they are fair game to be attacked by the National Syrian Army. Whatever the Syrian National Army does on its territory is perfectly legitimate.
John Mouracadeh, go ahead.
First of all, the overwhelming majority of Syrians is against the regime of Bashar al-Assad. So we have a different opinion here. Second,
yeah, you bet.
While your point...
Go ahead, John Mouracadeh.
Yes. While your point may be correct about the Syrian government being a Syrian government, the Syrian government has lost all legitimacy to govern over Syria the day he started killing its own people, destroying its own cities.
No, in the eyes of the sellouts and the traitors who support Saudi Arabia and America and Israel, that's all.
Okay, fine.
Just in the eyes of traitors and sellouts.
Yes, it seems to me that the traitors are the ones who are bombing the cities of Syria by airplanes and helicopters and barrel bombs. I think this is the regime of Bashar al-Assad. So when a regime bombs his own people and destroys his own city, and you see him as legitimate and free to do what he wants, I see him as a terrorist and a terrorist organization under the name of regime. So therefore, let's not get into this. You have your friends and you have your terrorists and I have my terrorists. So we both have terrorists.
Yes,
and
you
are
have your
terrorists on both
terrorists, indeed.
sides.
Well, Hafsa
None of
Kara-Mustapha,
you
it is
have
my
yours
friend.
as
It's
well.
the legitimacy of the Syrian people.
okay, this question was posed.
It is illegitimate.
No one is my friend in this. No one is my friend in this scenario. It is about the legitimacy of the Syrian government. It is what the Syrian people
Are
want.
you supporting the
Syrian people have
destruction? Are you
elected.
actually? Supporting the destruction of Syrian cities?
I do not support the destruction of Syria, and I support the legitimacy of the Syrian government.
So
Whether the leadership is called Assad or Mohammed or Omar is irrelevant. It is about the legitimacy of the Syrian leadership that should not be dictated by Saudi Arabia, Turkey or the US.
But you will destroy Syria. You will destroy Syria.
That have destroyed
and
the
you
region.
declare yourself legitimate. You destroy Syria, you accept the destruction of Syria by the air with barrel bombs and helicopters,
we got 30 seconds.
and you're standing here and calling legitimate.
Okay, I'm sorry. Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, last question. Bashar al-Jafari, the UN envoy, said this towards his statement at the end. 5.5 years of war. How do you think these terrorists operated on the ground? Where did their money, where did their supplies come from? Your reaction to his statement in closing.
It's a perfect point, because remember at the very beginning of this uprising, these were supposedly unarmed protesters, and suddenly they became very armed and they became very well trained, and they started attacking and destroying and bombing national infrastructure. So they're very clearly terrorists, and they're very clearly funded by foreign entities. Once you accept arms and funds to actually overthrow and destroy your government, you are terrorists, and you are by definition legal and fair game for your nation to destroy and to get rid of.
Thank you for that. Journalist and political commentator Hafsa Kara-Mustapha from London. Middle East expert Jihad Mouracadeh, thank you with this comments from Beirut. And thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, in the entire team in the capital, Tehran, goodbye.